There's no resume. Good afternoon, Mr. Commissioner. Good afternoon, Mr. Merrick. My name is Tim Leadham. I represent the Conservation Coalition, groups such as David Suzuki Foundation and other environmental groups in these proceedings. I want to commend you, firstly, for a very readable report.
Thank you.
I come down on the side of Dr. Peterman and like the analogies, because sometimes if we can analogize correctly, we can usually understand concepts which are often difficult. And so I find that it's very useful to try to do that. So if at any time during your answers you want to use metaphors and analogize, please do so. And I also happen to like colorful language, so you can insert that as well. I want to begin by drawing your attention to the workshop that you facilitated back in November 30th of last year. I think it was a 2-day workshop. And my understanding is that you facilitated a workshop in which all of the scientists who were preparing reports for the commission, the expert reports, or technical reports as we come to call them, assembled and over a 2-day period addressed a number of concepts, discussed the reports amongst themselves, and was a fair exchange of information, as scientists are very often capable of doing. Is that correct? Do I have that right?
Yes, that's correct. Now, this was November 30th and December 1st, and so the draft reports for each of those studies were in varying states of completion. So Dr. McKinnell's report was already done, but others were still in process. So they were at varying stages.
One of the tasks that you did during that workshop was to focus upon the 2010 PSC symposium that was the year before in June of 2010. And then you asked some of the participants at the workshop in November of 2010 to comment on that PSC workshop. And I want to just go with you to those results. I think at the tail end of your report.
Yeah, that's right. The last
actually,
2 pages.
1896, Mr. Lund.
Thank you.
And if we go to PDF 362, so you state there in Appendix D that workshop participants were asked to examine the PSC report. This is the one that Dr. Peterman and yourself, I think, were the facilitators of at SFU in June of 2010. Is that right?
Well, Dr. Peterman was the head of the science panel and the lead author in the report, and we worked as facilitators and assisted.
So if I look at this table, I think it's in 2 sections. There are a number of alternative hypotheses to explain the 2009 decline. And what I think, if I'm reading this report correctly, the top bar, the one in gray, is PSC, and then a workshop that you facilitated in November would be in yellow. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. If I could just make a couple of clarifications. First of all, for each of these hypothesized factors in the leftmost column in this Appendix D, we're looking at both the overall trend over the last 20 years as well as the 2009 low returns. The other thing to mention is that the PSC report, we had the workshop and then the panel met and considered their recommendations over a series of conference calls and exchanges of emails, whereas the workshop that we did for the Cohen Commission, November 30th, December 1st, we had maybe a couple of hours at which we had subgroups meeting to explore these ratings, so there really wasn't as much time or thought given to it.
Right, I understand that. We heard evidence also from, I think it was Dr. Rensel from, who had testified to this commission with respect to harmful algal blooms, that he was part of the PSC workshop, but I think there was a contingent from the United States that left, so they didn't get a chance to vote. Do you recall that?
That actually isn't the way it happened at the PSC workshop. What happened was that we met in subgroups and got input from those subgroups on particular hypotheses. And I was actually in the group that Dr. Rensel was in that dealt with harmful algal blooms and contaminants. That information was brought back to the science panel, and it was actually Brian Riddell who wrote the chapter dealing with contaminants and harmful algal blooms. So there's a lot of consideration that went into that, actually, by the PSC panel. Not so in the Cohen Commission, but it was considered in the PSC group.
What I want to focus on is marine ecology, the fourth hypothesis down on the left-hand column. And it was broken down into two discrete areas, the Strait of Georgia and then outside the Strait of Georgia. And so if I compare those for the overall, I take it that the dark shading meant that there was emphasis to be placed on that topic by the PSC workshop. Is that correct? Do I have that right?
A major difference between the PSC workshop is, at the PSC workshop we heard a lot about conditions in the Strait of Georgia, and the panel was convinced by those presentations that the Strait of Georgia were more important than the conditions outside of Georgia Strait, both for the overall changes as well as the 2009 poor returns. Now, the Cohen Commission, particularly Dr. McKinnell, presented other quite convincing evidence that there were weird things going on in 2007 in Queen Charlotte Sound as well, and that Strait of Georgia wasn't quite so bad. And so those scientists at the workshop came up with stronger weighting on conditions outside of Georgia Strait. Now, there's been further work done since then, which seems to indicate that both are important. So, you know, the truth may be simply
Somewhere
that.
in the middle. So if you were looking at the marine ecology to substantiate a hypothesis for the long-term decline as well as the 2009 decline, you really wouldn't want to dissect out the Strait of Georgia and simply focus upon that singularly. You would really want to look upon the total marine environment and include Queen Charlotte Sound as well.
Yes, I would.
If I could now ask you to turn to PDF 304. These pages are unnumbered. I think what I'm going to do is go back into the workshop and some of the reporting out that I think that you did of that workshop. I gather this is your work, Mr. Member?
The workshop that was done for the Cohen Commission, yes.
Yes.
We wrote the report from that workshop.
Okay. So under the heading Research and Monitoring Recommendations, and if I could just flip the page of PDF 305. And the second full paragraph on that page, I just want to take you there because this is one of the themes I've been pursuing throughout the body of work that I've been doing through this commission. You say there, one of the resounding issues throughout the workshop was researchers' difficulty in obtaining and understanding data from these existing databases. Considerable effort should be spent building and maintaining an integrated database with focused research and monitoring goals in mind. And then you go on to say the database should include the historical sockeye data with clear metadata as well as data from current and future monitoring. And in order for this to be useful to scientists, it need to be regularly updated and maintained. So I'm just going to stop there and see if I can expand a little bit on that, because all the scientists who participated were complaining to you, I gather, about the lack of consistency in the data and the ability to use data sources from different areas and be able to make them compatible. I'm not a mathematician, so I'm paraphrasing very roughly. Is that basically what the problem was, or is it a little bit more complex than that?
Well, I wouldn't say that all the scientists were complaining about this. I think one of the difficulties which existed was assembling all the productivity information on sockeye and getting that into a consistent format. The different stocks, or within a given stock, there are different life history patterns. Some fish spend 1 year in freshwater, some spend 2. They spend varying amounts of time in the ocean. And you have to line all of that information up if you're going to do these correlative analyses. And then the stressor information also comes from a whole bunch of different databases. So, I think the Cohen Commission has really catalyzed quite a bit of good effort that way, and the database that we assembled for this study, although it's just was an internal database, it's structured in a way that could be built upon. So I think we're making progress on both getting the metadata together as well as the stressor information and the sockeye information. Obviously, that would need to be updated every year, and you're not going to have a budget like the Cohen Commission does every year. So this has got to be made part of common practice.
In terms of any recommendations with respect to the data, can you help us at all in terms of how accessible this database should be, whether scientists who study in this realm should have access to it, whether there should be some limits on it, who gets to control it, who gets to put data into it? Do you have any recommendations with respect to those kinds of topics?
I think that past experience elsewhere has indicated that the people who are closest to collecting a particular kind of data, so let's say, for example, the Okanagan First Nation and DFO collect Okanagan sockeye data, are the best ones to organize that information and then say, we're happy with our analyses for this year, and put that out and then get that in a common framework. And then if there's some update to that, they discovered that there was an error, then they can update that information. I think then you can feel fairly assured that that information has been carefully checked and then put into a centralized or integrated database, which I think should be publicly accessible. There are examples like that. In the Columbia Basin, there's something called StreamNet, where there's public access. There's also the Columbia Basin Fish and Wildlife Authority has a publicly accessible, web accessible set of information. The key thing is it has to be carefully checked before it goes in there. And as far as being able to do analyses on the data, provided that that data's been quality checked, I don't see any reason why anybody shouldn't have access to the full suite of data, and that'll stimulate different kinds of analyses, which I think is healthy. The key thing is that what goes into it has to be carefully checked, and so there has to be a one group that's responsible for assuring that it is good quality. Mm-hmm. That's very important.
Yeah, I remember that acronym, garbage in, garbage out, so that if you're not putting in very reliable data, then you're obviously not going to be able to get the results that you want at the end of the day from being able to analyze that data and to synthesize it and have it form the basis of reports.
Yes, and the other thing is the metadata, which is the data about the data that says this is how it was acquired, these are the sampling methods, these are where the data came from. All those other details extremely important.
Now, I want to now, in addition to some of the workshops that focus on PSC, there was a full range of discussion about some of the projects that were ongoing, and I want to take you to some of the minutes of that meeting that occurred as well. If we can go to PDF, I believe it's 327. Now, at that time, my understanding as the group Counterpoint was actually going to file a report on status of DFO management and science, and as it turned out, that report never did get filed. Is that right?
That's what I've heard, but I haven't been tracking the thousands of documents.
Certainly it wasn't one that you analyzed when you came upon your cumulative effects analysis at the end of the day.
No, it wasn't, because it didn't pertain to describing the different stressors that we were analyzing.
And I'm just going to take you to some of the discussion that ensued when Edwin Blewett was presenting on behalf of this topic. If we can just go to the next page, PDF 328, please, Mr. Lund. There's a discussion, that's Dr. Skip McKinnell from Pisces, is that right?
Yes.
Saying, did you consider looking at the number of primary publications by DFO authors? You will likely find that the amount of science done as a proportion of the actual work they do has been shrinking over time. It would be useful to see a graph on the number of published articles on Fraser sockeye where DFO scientists were the senior authors. And then that discussion is then followed up by Dr. Peterman, and then continues on to the next page. You recall that discussion?
Yes, I do.
And that's a fair or accurate representation of the discussion that ensued about that topic, is it not?
Yes, my recollection is that Edwin Blewett did include some information, at least on scientific publications, in the executive summary of his report, but I don't know if it was exactly what Skip McKillen was asking for.
And similarly, the next topic at PDF 330 was diseases and parasites. This was a presentation by Dr. Kent, was it?
Yes.
The lead author for that. And then if you follow through to PDF 331, there's then a discussion that ensues. I imagine that what happened is that Dr. Kent, I wasn't there, and I would have loved to have been there, but I'm glad you did not have lawyers there, quite frankly. But essentially, as I understand it, someone presented the topic for about 15, 20 minutes, and then there was an opportunity for discussion from the attending scientists of that person. That's basically
correct.
The framework? So the discussion that ensued after Dr. Kent had presented his paper was mostly between Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Kent. And that would be Dr. John Reynolds, who was one of the outside reviewers and a professor at Simon Fraser University. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And so he says, at the conclusion of the presentation, he says, how specific, or he asks a question, how specific are these pathogens to specific species of salmon, and is it a good idea to restrict the scope to known cases involving sockeye? Kent says, I don't exclude any from the list. Where sockeye are less susceptible to disease, I would put it as a moderate risk assessment. And then Dr. Reynolds says, is that a good criterion to use? The study shows sea lice can affect other species of salmon and might be useful to tackle it head on, to take sea lice out of the picture. So once again, the discussion carries on for several pages after that, but essentially that would be an accurate representation of the discussion that ensued following Dr. Kent's presentation, would it not?
Yes, we had a very good recorder who taped the proceedings and then transcribed them, so I think this is an accurate description of the free-ranging discussion. I guess what I would say is that it's a free-ranging discussion at a workshop, and I think in general you need to look at all the information in detail, to make decisions rather than a 5-minute discussion.
On page PDF 332, I just want to focus on a comment that Dr. Kent made in response to Dr. Rick Rutledge, who was one of the outside reviewers. He's also a professor at SFU, is he not?
Yes, he is.
And about 1/3 of the way down, Dr. Rutledge asks, is there any evidence of vectors for disease to consider? And then Dr. Kent says, you can show in lab studies that LEP, and that would be the louse, the salmon louse, LEP, can jump from adult fish. Some pathogens, for example, are transmitted via leeches, but can also transfer through the water. And he goes on to say, could sea lice be transmitting disease? He asks himself that question. In freshwater, there have been increases in snail-borne disease due to increasing numbers of snails. And then he goes on to discuss a whirling disease. And then Dr. Reynolds chimes in and says, a recent paper showed sea lice do jump from host to host in the wild. Male LEP jump from pink to co-host smolts. So that, once again, was a flavor of the discussion that occurred with Dr. Kent and Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Rutledge concerning the vectors, the possibility that disease could be vectored, as you will, by something such as LEP. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's correct. And in the conceptual diagrams that you were looking at earlier from our addendum, that causal pathway is represented.
And one final topic that I want to focus on, if we can go to the next page, PDF 333. Don McDonald, who was the author of, I think, the technical report on contaminants, then presented. And he presented his findings, and then there was a brief discussion that ensued following his report, mostly with Dr. Peterman and Dr. Rutledge. And once again, that was a discussion that followed the presentation of Mr. McDonald's report, was it not?
Yes, that's correct.
And I just find that this whole process to be rather invigorating and enlightening. Unlike this kind of situation where it's very controlled, where I get to ask the questions and hopefully you get to respond. When scientists meet, it seems to be a free-ranging debate. And so I think at the end of the day, one of the things that I've been proposing is that there be some way to move forward on the science that needs to be done. You've identified, for example, some specific scientific research areas that you would like to see followed. And you've identified those in bold, and you've identified them with respect to life cycles and life stages of the salmon. And others have preceded you to the podium, and obviously they also have specific research topics that they would like to see done. More often than not, it happens to coincide with the area of expertise that they happen to be involved with. But I guess I want to come back to this. If we're going to move forward in terms of the science and the ability of science to really grapple with this issue of what's behind the decline of the sockeye, or how can we ameliorate the condition of the sockeye, what kind of apparatus can you envisage being brought forward to see that work is conducted and carried out?
So first of all, I think it's important to point out that our recommendations in section 5.2 were not just our suggestions or
Yes.
my ideas. These were built, as we said earlier, on the work that came out of the Pacific Salmon Commission workshop, as well as the recommendations of all the Cohen Commission researchers. So, and as I was saying earlier to the Cohen Commission lawyer, I think the first step is to decide what are the key management decisions that need to be made, and what are the scientific uncertainties that affect those management decisions, and then to have a dialogue between managers and a subset of scientists from DFO, NOAA Fisheries, Pacific Salmon Commission, plus others, academia, but a smallish group, a manageable group, to winnow down that list to set forth a sequence of studies that are cost effective for answering specific questions, and to put in place the infrastructure that will maintain those studies for a sufficient length of time. So as was mentioned earlier, that we have a continuing time, which I think it was with the lawyer from the province. So, as I was asked earlier by the commission lawyer, that's my opinion on how to set that up. There may be a better way. There may be other people who have better ideas about that, but that wasn't within our terms of reference to decide, or recommend that kind of structure. It just seems logical given who has the mandate. In the United States, NOAA Fisheries does, and in Canada, DFO does, and both are on the PSC, so those seem like logical leaders to tackle it.
All right. We'll come back to that concept tomorrow. I think we're at the end for today, Mr. Commissioner.
Mr. Commissioner, I wonder if we can organize our timing for tomorrow. We'll be starting at 9 and ending at 3. And I was going to propose that we could maybe go from 9 to 10:30 and take a break at 10:30, and then go from whenever we come back from that break to 12:30, just the one break in the morning. Would that be acceptable?
I guess my answer is we'll see, but that sounds like not an unreasonable proposal, Ms. Baker. But just before we break, I just wanted to ask a question to clarify something that Mr. Leadham asked the witness, and I must apologize. I'm not sure that it's possibly Exhibit 1896. It was the paragraph dealing with database, Mr. Leadham, that you were asking the witness about, and I just, was that Exhibit 1896?
That was 1896.
And it might have been, was it page 305 possibly?
It was PDF 305.
I'm sorry, PDF 305. Apologize, I just, that's probably it. Yes.
Sorry about the pagination, that's our fault.
No, that's fine. I just take a moment just to ask you this. And I'm not being facetious, but what do you mean by database in the context of of this paragraph?
So, an organized form of data includes, for this problem, all the information on the numbers of spawners from each stock, the age structure of each of those stocks, so how many return as 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, how many years they spend in fresh water, the proportions and so on, which can vary by year. So, and that's for both, that would be for both Fraser stocks as well as for non-Fraser stocks. And then the information on various stressors, which we were discussing earlier with respect to the analyses that were included in section 4.7 of our report. So, for example, let's find the section here. Page 93, not the PDF page, but the actual page, yes, this table. That's an example of the kind of stressor variables which would be helpful to include in such a database. And a database, a relational database, is an organized framework which links information by stock, by year, by location, by type of information, by variable name. There's a nice description of it in Appendix 3 of our report. It's a very structured way of organizing information, as opposed to what generally exists, which are a whole bunch of different spreadsheets that are different for different stocks and in different locations and for different stressors. And what we had to do was basically grab all that information and organize it into this structured framework and relate them all. So that's what we call an organized database.
And that's what you're speaking of.
Yes.
You can follow up tomorrow with that, Mr. Leedham.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
But I appreciate that answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hearing is now adjourned till 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. Council, as you know, the elevators are usually locked off to at 8:30 or until 8:30, so we're going to try to get that adjusted to 8 o'clock.